Thanks to all of you. I know there are many things you could be doing with your evening. I also know that during this particular season, you have about 1,736 different political candidates to listen to. So I'm grateful to you for giving me a listen. And Reverend Ed could not have put more perfectly the reasons I'm here. First of all, when he mentioned that today is the day of Yom Kippur, almost finished, sundown will be the end of the day. This is the holiest day of the year in the Jewish religion, which is the Day of Atonement. But you know, the deepest spiritual principles in all the great universal, in all the great religions and spiritual traditions are universal. So when a Jew worships on Yom Kippur, it's very similar to what happens when a Catholic goes to confession. It's very similar to what happens in an AA meeting, when in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the steps say that one must take a fearless moral inventory and admit the exact nature of your wrongs. So these themes show up different places, but the themes themselves are the same. The truth is one, with a capital T, and it is expressed in different ways in different religious and spiritual practices, and many people, through very secular contexts, find the deeper life, the more reflective life, the more loving life, the more conscience-filled life, and there's no sense to them that there is religious or spiritual inquiry there, and that's fine. Because ultimately those things are just words. What matters is that the experience and the experience of love. Now, Buddha was born about 500 years before Jesus. And Buddha talked about action and reaction, or karma, which we in the Western world would call the law of cause and effect. Is that whatever you put out there has a consequence. Now, Jesus, being a Jew, coming from a tradition of atonement, basically the message of Jesus was, yes, but in a moment of in a moment of grace, your karma is burned. Now, what does that mean? Well, atonement, grace, those moments of reconciliation with God, can be likened to a cosmic reset button. And the reason you have to clean up the past is because the past will continue to have repercussions in the future until you break that past. So as long as we are dealing with the thoughts and the energies that come from the past, they will continue to have results. And in a moment of atonement, you break the pattern, and you are given the greatest gift that God gives us, really, and that is the chance to begin again. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a day of national fasting and prayer, in which he said that a nation, like individuals, must confess its sins. And as Ed was talking about with the Germans, and he's absolutely right, when the president or the prime minister, I'm not sure which, of Germany went to Poland after the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered during the World War II by the Germans. And when he went and he made an official apology. And of course, Germany has also paid reparations. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to the Jewish people, to Jewish organizations since World War II. Now, that doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone a far distance towards establishing reconciliation, which that word that Ed used, reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. So, just like in something like Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about atonement, and then they talk about amends. It's a two-part process. One is to atone, one is to make amends. So if I've done you wrong, I must atone. I must atone in my heart for any wrong that I've done. But the issue of amends is also an important part of the process, because it means I do something about it, if there is something that can be done. Let's say you had taken $1,000 from me. I would appreciate your apology, but I'd also like my money back. So the idea of an amends and the idea of repair has to do not only with reconciliation in your heart, the admission that you've done wrong, an apology, prayer for forgiveness, but it also means making amends where possible. Now, a very significant place where reconciliation is now needed has to do with reconciliation between the goodness in the hearts of the American people and the way that our government too often behaves. I like the American people. I always, whenever I'm flying internationally, I always say, ooh, I hope I get to sit next to an American on an airplane. I like us characterologically. I think we're good. We're decent, we're good people. I'm not saying I think we're better than other people, because I don't think we're better than other people, but I think we're as good as anybody else. And my experience leads me to believe that the average American does think about what it means to live a good life. I think the average American does care. I think the average American does care about love, does try to do right by other people. I think the average American, in their own way, does ask, well, what's the right thing to do? Did I treat that person right? What is the thing which is filled with integrity? I don't think the behavior of the average American is the problem that we have here. The problem we have is the divergence, and it has become, I believe, a dangerous divergence between the basic consciousness of decency and dignity of the American people and that which is expressed by too much of American public policy. Now, in a democracy, the whole idea of a representative democracy is that the will of the people would be reflected in the people who we elect. So everybody votes, and then your values, theoretically, the things you think are important, you express who you vote for, and then theoretically those people would then be behaving in terms of lawmaking according to your consciousness or your will, if only. Because what has happened in our country over the last few decades is that the undue influence of money, particularly corporate donations, has become so gargantuan that for all intents and purposes, the will or the consciousness of the American people is not what is primarily reflected in the behavior of our government, so much as our governmental policies reflect the advocacy for these huge corporate donations. We all know that. It's not like I just told you anything that we don't already know. But sometimes in life, you have to do more than know something. You have to own what you know. You have to stop looking away from what you know. You have to stop allowing yourself to be distracted from what you know. And when it comes to the things we're talking about here tonight, it is our responsibility as Americans, not just to know this, but to do something about this. Because democracy, which when it works, is so extraordinary. It's that which means, for instance, let's talk for a moment about the separation of church and state. Perfect example. One of the most enlightened pillars of the United States Constitution. Now, what does it mean exactly? Well, it has a twofold function. One is that when Congress meets at the Capitol in Washington, no minister, no priest, no rabbi, no monk, no mufti, no imam, no ayatollah is going to open the doors, walk down the aisle, tear up a law that our lawmakers just made, and say, you can't pass that law. Pass this one instead. That's what would happen in a place like Iran, where you have the supreme religious leader who can override what the political leaders decide. That can't happen here. But it's a dual function because something similarly important happens in the opposite way. Not only is no religious clergy or institution able to determine what laws can or cannot be passed in this country, there's something else equally important. You and I are meeting at this church tonight, and we are absolutely 100% sure no policeman's coming through the door to say, break it up. No policeman's coming when the Jews met today. I went to the Central Synagogue last night. We knew that no policeman was coming in to say, break it up. We know whether it's a mosque, a synagogue, a church, an AA meeting, a yoga class, even an atheist meeting. Because the freedom of religion in this country not only is the freedom to worship however you wish, but whether or not you wish, which is also very important. The people who do not choose to worship religiously are also protected. So that's what separation of church and state is, that the government will not be interfered with by religious institutions, and religious institutions will not be interfered with government. But by government. But at the same time, look at what that means. That means that the founders were protecting what's going on here, not seeking to suppress what's going on here. And that's extremely important. Spirituality is the path of the heart. And so the founders were not seeking in any way to limit the expression of the path of the heart. In the 1960s, there was passed in Congress the Johnson Amendment. Now, all that the Johnson Amendment, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Johnson Amendment said, because it means something that I think has been misinterpreted by a lot of, particularly in the New Thought churches. It doesn't mean that anybody from a pulpit can't talk about governmental matters or governmental issues. All that the Johnson Amendment means, the only thing that would threaten the tax-exempt status of a church is, or any religious institution, is if the pulpit was used specifically to endorse a candidate or specifically endorse a policy, a specific piece of legislation. But there was nothing in our founding that in any way was an invitation to suppress the spiritual or religious conversation. Now, when our country was founded, we had 56 very brave men who signed the Declaration of Independence. And with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, something extraordinary was established in this country, something that had never been true on the planet, something radical, in fact. It was radical in 1776, and it's radical today. The very idea that God created all men equal, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that it's the government's job, governments are instituted to secure those rights, and if the government's not doing that, then it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. That is completely turning the old paradigm on its ear, because the old paradigm that had ruled and prevailed within Europe for centuries was monarchy and aristocracy. The king, the will of the king was what was considered sacrosanct, and no, the people did not have the right to overturn that. And the aristocracy was a small group of people, the wealthy ones, and they had the opportunities. They had the opportunities to own land. They had the opportunities to get educated. They had the opportunities to create wealth, and nobody else did. Everybody else was a serf, basically, a little more than a serf, which is a little more than a slave. With this country, that was completely repudiated. But that's also where it got very gnarly, because 41 signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. So the United States has always been both. That's our story. It's built into our characterological DNA. That bipolar quality, that's our story. That on one hand, we are based on the most enlightened and the most aspirational principles that have ever formed the founding of a country, and at times have been the most violent perpetrators of transgression against the principles on which we purport to stand. It's important that we know that, because it gives us a sense of where we are. It gives us a sense of who we are, just like when you go to therapy and you learn about your family. You learn about the history of your people. We often do that if you're gay, or if you're black, or if you're Jewish, or if you're a woman. Women do that. What's the history? How is this whole thing unfolded before I got here? And we need to do more of that right now as Americans. It's like, wow, that's where it all started, and that's what plays itself out generation after generation after generation. The point is, how do we reconcile? How do we reconcile? That's what atonement is. Let us reconcile. Let us put these two things together. That's what the abolitionists were. That's what the women's suffragettes were. That's what the civil rights movement were, and notice that all of those came from religious and spiritual sources. The abolitionist movement grew out of the early evangelicals and Quakers. And many of the women who were the head of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. The whole notion of Quakerism is the light within every man, woman, and child. in which we are all one, in which we are all equal. And of course, the Civil Rights Movement was a Baptist preacher and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So throughout our history, when American public policy ran counter to our principles, and clearly slavery is counter to our principles. Clearly the suppression of women is counter to our principles. Clearly segregation and institutionalized white supremacy is counter to our principles. There have been, in those situations, generations of Americans that woke up, stood up, and stepped in. And that is what brought public policy in all of those situations back into alignment, not only with our principles, but with the goodness in our hearts. Now, I was mentioning earlier how over the last 40 years, money, the undue influence of money on our political system has become so gargantuan, so beyond anything that most of us can even consider as real, because we're talking about billions of dollars, right? It has become so gargantuan that basically it has hijacked our democracy. It has corrupted our democracy because it has turned us into a situation where our government does more to advocate for short-term profits for huge corporations whose money flood Washington and whose lobbyists flood Washington than it does to advocate for us. It's not an immoral economic system, it's just that it's an amoral economic system. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not like people are sitting in a room seeking to do harm to people. It is simply that people are sitting in a room feeling justified to make their corporate decisions based on only what would increase the short-term profits of the corporations rather than on what would necessarily help people. So whether it's health insurance companies or big pharmaceutical companies or gun manufacturers or chemical companies or defense contractors or oil and gas, it's not like these are bad people figuring out who we can hurt. That's not what's going on here. It is morally neutral, and moral neutrality is enough to do you in. Because what they're saying is, hey, I'm just trying to ensure the short-term profits for my stockholders. That was a theory called trickle-down economics. It came about in the 80s, and if we would just do everything possible, get the government out of the way with those pesky regulations, business-killing regulations. Let's be really clear here, ladies and gentlemen, those regulations are called safety regulations, health regulations. And they don't kill business because you have to create jobs in order to fulfill the mandates of the regulations. But the idea was all that money was going to be created for this stockholder class, and we're going to lower corporate taxes so that all this money can be made by corporations. And then the idea was that all this money would trickle down. That's why it's called trickle-down economics, and all that would lift all boats. So what do you think, guys? Don't you think 40 years is long enough to say, I think the jury's in? So trickle-down economics has not lifted all boats. Quite the opposite. It has left millions and millions and millions of Americans without even a life vest. In the 1970s, we didn't have this wealth inequality. Since trickle-down economics has created this huge transfer of wealth into the hands of a very few Americans, we now have a situation where our middle class has been devastated. We have 1% of Americans owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. We have 40% of Americans living in chronic economic anxiety. What does that do to people? What does that do to people who have to worry every single day, what will happen if I get sick? What will happen if one of my kids gets sick? How will I send my children to college? How will I pay off my college loan? Now, Reverend Cheryl and Reverend Ed, talking about my career, many of you probably know my career over the last 35 years. And I'm honored to be in a profession where we kind of help people through periods of crisis. people don't come to see us because things are going well. We work up close and personal. People don't call me up and say, Marianne, things are going so well, I thought we could chat about it. I get a call, could we talk? What does that mean? That means the test results came back and it's cancer. It means my child is addicted and it's heroin. It means my spouse just said they're leaving. It means my business is completely gone under and I don't know what I'll do. But my career is 35 years old. And I started seeing something about 20 years ago that was different. And it is encapsulated in a story I once heard. I don't know what the title of this story would be, but I think of it as the transition or the journey from that of the good Samaritan to what we might think of as the conscious Samaritan. The Good Samaritan's walking down the road, and the Good Samaritan sees a beggar. And the Good Samaritan gives alms to the beggar. And then the Good Samaritan continues down the road and sees another beggar and gives alms to that beggar. And then the Good Samaritan continues down the road again and sees another beggar and gives that beggar alms. And then the Good Samaritan continues down the road and sees another beggar and gives that beggar alms. And then the Good Samaritan continues down the road and sees that beggar and gives that beggar alms. At a certain point, the Good Samaritan says to him or to herself, I wonder why there are so many beggars. And that began to happen to me. It began to happen around 15 or 20 years ago. Why is it that in the richest country in the world, it would be different if we weren't the richest country in the world, but we are the richest country in the world. Why was I seeing so many people who were living good lives and working really hard having such a tough time? Why was I seeing so many people who were working hard and doing the right thing but having to work more than one, sometimes two, three jobs? Why was I seeing people who were living good lives and trying to do the right thing, sometimes having achieved things like they're doctors or they're lawyers, and they're still so burdened by college loans they don't know how they'll ever be out from under them? And so I began to see the effects of bad public policy on people's lives. And the more the years went by, the more I began to see, oh, this is systemic at this point. This is more than a pattern. This is baked into how things are done here. If you have that much money placed in the hands of just a few people, not like America doesn't have money. It's that in the last 40 years, we've had such a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a very few. And you see, that was going to be, they were going to be the job creators, and then they were going to, it's like corporate aristocrats. It's a new aristocracy. And they're going to drop crumbs from the table in the form of job creation. And I would see one political party just want to drop crumbs. I'd see another political party say, you don't have to take crumbs, we'll give you a cookie. And I'm thinking, no, this is America. Everybody's supposed to have a chance to feast at the table. This is America. And I began to realize that this had become so much a pattern of just the way things are done that there weren't enough people anymore who had that kind of rambunctious spirit that we had in 1776. That hell no to tyranny. That is the spirit of the abolitionists, and that was the spirit of the women's suffragette, and that was the spirit of the civil rights worker, that this is not right, therefore it will not continue. It is a public policy, but it is morally wrong. It is undemocratic. It goes against our human principles. And so generations have risen up to say, this stops now. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1776, we repudiated an aristocracy. It is time to repudiate it again. And in those situations, such as abolition, and such as the civil rights movement, and such as women's suffrage, those changes did not occur because the government decided to change its ways. That's not what happened. It happened because people woke up, people stepped up, and people stepped in. But even now, We're told that we just have to figure out which side of the establishment will repair itself. Which side is going to do it right? Well, I would submit to you that the political establishment, the status quo, that's what status quos do. They perpetuate themselves. No, ladies and gentlemen, if we really want change, it's time for the people to step in. Right now, we're in such opposition. Everybody's so against each other. I'm reminded of a line from A Course in Miracles where it says, God does not give you victory in battle. God lifts you above the battlefield. We need a politics that's above the battlefield. Mahatma Gandhi said that politics should be sacred. He did not mean it should be religious. It should not be about religious dogma or doctrine. We have a tradition in this country that I think all of us should respect, and that is of a secular conversation, secular language when we're talking about political issues. But as I said earlier this evening, that doesn't mean we don't put our moral values into our political conversation. We must, because when any area of life lacks a conversation about what is right versus what is wrong, what is loving versus what is unloving, anytime you lack a conversation about what is loving, then you're talking about something which is essentially heartless. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of American public policy is heartless. It is heartless. When a black person is indicted for a crime in the United States, 19.1% is the number that a black person who is sentenced to prison in the United States is likely to get longer of a prison sentence than a white person. Too much of our criminal justice policies are heartless. Too much of our environmental policies, the irreverence shown to the earth, it's heartless. The fact that there are 43 million hungry Americans, 13 million of them children. The fact that millions of American children go to school every day and ask the teacher if they have something for them to eat. That there are millions of American children who go to school every single day in classrooms that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. This is the richest country in the world. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. The fact that millions of American children live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where the violence in their families, their communities, and their schools is so great that they are suffering what psychologists tell us is a form of PTSD, no less severe than if they were veterans from Afghanistan or Iraq. These children, their despair is simply normalized by the political establishment. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a political constituency. They're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. How can they possibly compete with the clout of these corporate forces whose money dominates Washington? That is heartless. The fact that even as we speak, the United States, for the sake of $360 billion in an arms sale, is giving aerial support to the Saudi Arabians, who are now waging a genocidal war that this would just make our grandparents roll over in their graves. We are giving aerial support to a genocidal war that is being waged right now by the Saudi Arabians against Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have starved because of this war, many of them children whose pictures are all over the internet. That's heartless. And yet, why do we do those things? It's all about the money, ladies and gentlemen. As long as we have this much money wielding this much undue influence on our politics, until we, the people, demand public legislation to establish federal public funding for federal campaigns, until we demand that there is a constitutional amendment demanding public funding for federal campaigns, then it's going to be short-term profits for defense contractors that's going to be determining too much of our national security agenda. It's going to be the short-term profits of health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies that's going to be determining too much of our health policies. It's going to be profitability for gun manufacturers. It's going to be determining too much of our gun safety legislation. It's going to be fossil fuel companies and chemical companies that are going to be determining too much of our environmental policies. And ladies and gentlemen, let's be really clear about this. This can't go on forever. You know, unfortunately, Ed was talking about his niece and her journey through recovery from alcohol and drug use. It's a common story in America today. Ed talked about his niece in recovery. We all know the story. Most of us on some level have been there, had a loved one, whatever. And there is a certain phone call that most people in this room have either made, have had someone make to you, or at the very least, you know about this phone call. And it goes like this. Hi. Were you at the party last night? Yeah, I was there. Did you see him? Yeah, I know, I saw it. He fell down the stairs. You saw that, right? Yeah, I saw it. Did anybody else see it? Yeah, I think several people saw it. Silence. Do you think it's time we need to do something? Yes. Yeah, I've been thinking that too. I don't know who to call. Do you know who to call? Yeah, I have a friend, and she knows somebody who's an interventionist, and I think we can call him. We know that story. What it means is friends or loved ones knew that they were at the point. It was in their gut. They knew it. We better intervene. Because we have learned, because of so much drug and alcohol addiction in America, we get now, the average American gets, the survival of the human body is not guaranteed. You abuse it too much, there's no guarantee it will survive. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to get out of our magical thinking about this. There's no guarantee our democracy will survive either. And the way we are treating this earth, there's not even a guarantee the human species will survive for another 100 years on this planet. Now, I said something earlier about how we just need to own what we know. I didn't say anything here this evening that you don't know. I might have told a couple details, the details about the kids, the detail about the environment. We might not have known every detail, but the basic story that I just said tonight, we know. This is not about the era of data collection. I don't feel talking to people such as yourselves, come on guys, you gotta see this. No, we see this. Now the issue is, are we going to have the courage to own what we know? Are we going to allow ourselves to be distracted? Too many people in the so-called spiritual communities have used a very odd notion of spirituality to justify chronic political disengagement over the last few decades. In fact, there is absolutely no religious or spiritual path anywhere that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. There's a difference between denial and transcendence. If you say, oh, it's just so toxic, I can't look at it. See, that's how we got here. That's how we got here. Too many of the best people in America said, it's toxic, I can't look at it. Great, so it just got more toxic, which made people even less willing to look at it. But that's not our function on this earth. God has asked us to love each other. Did he just say love each other when it's easy? Did he just say love each other when it's convenient? There's a marvelous sign in the back there. To say we are here to love doesn't just mean love the people who are nice to you. And it doesn't just mean love your children. The love that will save the world means we have to love the children on the other side of town. It means we have to love the children on the other side of the world. The American who would say, well, my child isn't hungry. My child goes to a classroom, they have glue sticks and paper. They have adequate school supplies, but very few Americans, if they're honest with themselves, don't know. Maybe not on your side of town, but there are millions of those kids. They just don't live maybe where you live. And those Yemeni children, we just won the birth lottery. We could have been born in Yemen. I remember when we invaded Iraq. And I remember I was in Canada, and my daughter was a little one at the time. I was in Canada in a hotel room, and my daughter was home, and I called home to tell the housekeeper and somebody else who was at my house, don't turn on television, don't turn on television, because she might see, and I don't want her to see it. Make sure you don't turn on television. They said, what are you talking about? I said, well, we're invading Iraq right now. They're dropping bombs on Baghdad right now. And they were like, oh. I was fearful for my country right then. Not just that we were dropping bombs on people who had done nothing to us. Nothing to us. You know, I remember there was a woman at that time. Her name was Laurie Meadoff. I wonder if she's still doing this work. Today, with the internet, it doesn't seem so radical, but at that time, it was a big deal. And she had put, it was in the run-up to the invasion of Baghdad. Laurie had created this situation where these American high school students were hooked up on the internet. Once again, like today, it's no big deal, but at the time it was kind of a big deal, you know, because it was early. And the kids in an American classroom, some high school kids in America, were talking to these high school kids in Iraq. And it was so amazing what happened. God does work in mysterious ways. First of all, the kids in Iraq were dressed in things like Hard Rock Cafe t-shirts. You know, they just looked like any high school student here. And one of the girls, who was particularly articulate, was also gorgeous. And these American boys just kind of didn't know what to do with this. And they were saying, why are you talking about invading us? Why are you talking about invading us? And these kids who had been so indoctrinated, well, you know, Saddam Hussein's a bad guy, man. We got to go in there. He's a bad guy. And I remember this one girl, so beautiful and so articulate, who said to these boys, so I have to die because he's bad? My parents have to die because he's bad? And these kids in Iraq, it was so perfect because the fact that they were dressed the same way as the American kids, they talked the same way as the American kids. And like I said, that one girl who was just blowing the mind of these boys, you could just see it. Because somehow these young Americans had been somehow desensitized to the humanity of people on the other side of the world. And that's what I felt that day when I called home and my friends went, oh yeah, I saw something. Yeah, I remember one of them said, I saw something about that. Yeah, I turned on TV, I saw something about that. What do you mean you saw something about that? Those were not fireworks. Those were not fireworks. And that's why this whole desensitization from our pain is not a good thing. Sometimes you want to feel pain. Because if you desensitize yourself to your own pain, you're more likely to desensitize yourself to the pain in others. So the abolitionists refused to look away. Women suffragettes refused to look away. Civil rights workers refused to look away. Sometimes I hear people these days talk about how traumatizing everything is. I've heard people say, since Trump's been president, I'm just traumatized by the whole thing. Well, I'm not minimizing the effects of trauma, but I think it is worth noting that the people who walked across the bridge in Selma would have been traumatized. They didn't know that they were going to send the dogs. They didn't know if they were going to send the hoses, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't know if they were going to start shooting. And yet they walked. You know, we are the inheritors of a great legacy in this country. Yes, we have a legacy of, like I said, some violent perpetration of transgression against our own principles. We've had slavery in this country. We have had the genocide of Native Americans, cultural annihilation. We've had terrible things, terrible problems in this country, and we have terrible problems today. But let us identify with the problem solvers. But if we're going to do that, it's time for us to do more than just post a petition on Facebook. And I have felt for a long time when it comes particularly to New Thought, religion and spirituality. I've been so grateful to Reverend Cheryl, to Reverend Ed, to so many of my colleagues, people I know now, particularly in the New Thought movement. There's an awakening now. There's an awakening now, and we must continue it. Because people who have a clue as to what changes one heart, you're the one who has a clue as to what would change the world. The people who do spiritual seeking, who take love seriously, the visionaries, the lovers, the artists, the teachers, the scientists, the educators, the healers, these are the last people who should be standing on the sidelines. These are the last people who should be standing on the periphery. These should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. I don't need to tell anybody here, hatred has become politicized. Today, in Germany, on Yom Kippur, a Nazi or Nazi sympathizer, obviously, started shooting Jews in Germany. Well, we had a Nazi sympathizer, a white supremacist, who shot a Jewish woman at a synagogue in Florida recently. And I don't need to tell anyone in Charleston. I don't need to tell anyone in Charleston. So hatred has been in our past, turned into political expression, and unfortunately, in the present, we have a specter of white nationalism, Nazism, some very, very serious forces that have unfortunately not been totally and completely banned from our midst, and even now, partly because of social media, partly because of certain dog whistles that have been sent out from very high places, that political expression is forming force again. Ladies and gentlemen, at a time when hatred is so loud, it is not enough for love to whisper. The problem is not that there are more haters than lovers in this country. There are so many more lovers than haters in this country. And there are so many more lovers than haters in this world. But you know, conviction is a force multiplier. And those who hate today hate with conviction. I can't imagine a terrorist. I can't imagine a serious white nationalist who is kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's convenient, committed to their cause. These people are serious, and they've shown how serious they are. But too often, those of us who are committed to love are kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's convenient, committed to our cause. I'm really into it when it's my own relationship. I'm really into it when it's my own career. I'm really into it when it's my own tribe. I'm really into it when it's my own community. And like I said, it's not like Americans don't think about love and goodness and mercy and compassion. I think we do. But what has happened in the last few years is that we think about these things too often only as they relate to the private sphere, and we must think about them as they relate to the public sphere. You can't just say, is it good how I treated you? We also, as citizens, are responsible to ask, is it good what the United States is doing in Yemen? Is it good that so many millions of children are hungry and are going to school in classrooms where they don't even have adequate school supplies, and where we're primarily basing our educational funding on property taxes, so the children who are in economically advantaged neighborhoods have a very good chance in this country of a very high quality public school education, but if they don't, then they're not. I have been here in South Carolina to your incredible governor schools. You have these two governor schools, the governor schools of math and science and the governor schools of arts and the humanities. They're amazing. If you haven't visited, I highly recommend that you do. They're both totally inspiring and totally heartbreaking. Inspiring because they show what our children could do all day, but heartbreaking in that, 280 students at each one. Every school in America should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. Every school in America. And we have to wake up, just like when, we all read books about the sociopath next door, and we read books about abusive relationships, and we have zero tolerance for all that stuff. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a sociopath is just someone who has no empathy, no remorse, no conscience. If that's what a person is with no sympathy and no conscience and no remorse, if you have a person with no conscience and sympathy and no remorse and you call that a sociopath, what do you call an economic system that has no sympathy, no conscience, and no remorse? It is a sociopathic economic system that is running the show in America today. As though economics should have nothing to do with any of this. It absolutely should. And even Milton Friedman, who is the main articulator of trickle-down economics, he himself said, yes, but you also have to have a universal basic income or it will not be safe. Ladies and gentlemen, when people say this country should be run like a business, you say to them, sure as hell shouldn't. It should be run like a family. First, you feed your children. And when anybody says we don't have the money for it, I read a study, and it said that for a woman to feel confident, to share her opinion, she has to feel 80% sure of her facts. And for a man to feel confident to share his opinion, he has to feel 20% sure of his fact. So I want to throw out some facts out there. This is not the time for us to be quiet, ladies and gentlemen. And anybody who says, oh, we can't afford it, let me tell you something. You want to have a vibrant economy 10 years from now? I'll tell you what you do. Take better care of your children today. There is no power in the sun and no power in the wind and no power that we can mine underneath the ground that can begin to fuel peace and prosperity in the next century like the power in the brain of a child. That should be our responsibility. If we want to take care of future generations, we should be making sure that every kindergartner in every American school has every possible opportunity to self-actualize. Think of the unrealized potential, economic potential, the unrealized economic potential, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, probably trillions of dollars, that we will never see if we do not realize the potential that lies in the brain of a child. We know things now about the brains of children that we didn't even know 50 years ago, that we didn't even know in terms of the neuroplasticity and all of those things, cognitive functioning that goes on. And that's where money comes from. Money doesn't come from a bunch of corporate aristocrats who just drop crumbs from their table in the form of job creation. We really need to wake up now. We really need to have the intervention first on ourselves. I'll tell you where money comes from. Money comes from the creativity and the productivity of the American people. That's where you'll get money from. You'll get money and you'll get peace from doing things which allow people to thrive. All public policy, if we are going to reconcile the goodness in our hearts with domestic and international policy, our educational policies, our foreign policies, our environmental policies, everything should be built around one core principle. What would help people thrive? What would uncap people's dreams? What would unleash people's spirits? Because then they'll be happy. Then they will be better employers and better employees and better spouses and better parents and better citizens. And that's where harmony comes from, and that's where money comes from. We've been fooled, ladies and gentlemen. And we've been fooled because we have not bonded appropriately in our generation with the principles of that Declaration of Independence. Remember what I said, all men are created equal. God gave all men unalienable rights of life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. It's the job of government to secure those rights. Where is the right to pursue happiness on the part of those millions of American children? Is that child in that neighborhood, in that situation, unable to even be taught to read? Where is their right to pursue happiness? Where have we forgotten that in the Declaration of Independence it says that the governments are instituted to secure those rights, and if it's not doing their job, it's our job, our right to alter it or to abolish it. Oh, those principles are written on marble walls. Those principles are written on parchment. But if they're not alive in our hearts, for all intents and purposes, they're dead. That's why you have holidays. That's why the Jews come together once a year to atone. That's why the Catholics go to confession. That's why people go to church, to revisit that place within us where we know the truth, where we reconcile, where we atone for our mistakes. I think it's time for the United States to atone. It's time for the United States to atone. We need a politics which is so beyond left and right, in which we simply go to that moral high ground where it's not a left-right issue whether or not you feed your children. It's not a left-right issue whether or not you repair your earth. It's not a left-right issue where you realize we really shouldn't spend so much money on ways to endlessly prepare war when so much of that has to do with just short-term profits of defense contractors over and above the money that the military says that they need, as opposed to the fraction of that that we give to people who actually build peace. We need some serious changes. We need changes in all of our public policies, whether it has to do with environmental policies, educational policies, poverty, policies about hunger, policies about peace building, policies about our children, policies about our health. Because right now, they are in the grip. They are in the grip of something that is very, very dark. It's very, very dark because it's heartless. And we need to intervene. And that's not just our right. That's our responsibility. We are citizens of the most powerful nation in this world. And when we get it right, we have been and are a light unto the nations. And when we get it wrong, so we're not a country that never got it wrong before. Of course, we've gotten it wrong before. But generations rose up and made it right. And what you and I are going through is just the newest iteration. America has been through all this stuff before. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to put this country back on track. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.